All right, hello again, Ling 201. We're back for more morphology. This is part 3 now. Before we get into this lecture, which is basically about different kinds of affixes that we can attach to words in complex morphological tree structures, I want to let you know that there is a quick write for this particular lecture. This one's on alternation, so we're not going to talk about the results of this one today, but it will become relevant for what we talk about in the next lecture, which will be the last lecture on morphology. So I guess we can look forward to that. But be that as it may, in this quick write, I've given you some sort of made-up words, new verbs in English, and what I want you to do is to kind of put these verbs in the past tense and see what you come up with without saying anything more about them. In the old days, I used to have people work with a partner with this quick write and ask them specific questions, which they would answer orally. If you want to actually try that out with a friend, you can go ahead and do that, communicating in whatever way is works best for you in the weird modern day and age. Otherwise, you can do it just on your own. Either way is fine as long as you send me the answers. And we'll talk about them next time in Morphology Part 4. But before we get there, we need to do Morphology Part 3. Okay, so like I said, this lecture is mostly about different kinds of affixes that we see in language. And we've seen a basic kind of distinction already between prefixes and suffixes in affixes in English. We also know that other languages can have infixes and circumfixes. We don't see those as often in English, but they are still there in certain circumstances. A sort of more fundamental distinction, aside from like where the affixes actually attach in a word, is the distinction between inflections versus derivations, or inflectional affixes and derivational affixes. So, like I said, this is kind of fundamental, and I'll walk you through the basic properties that each of these kinds of affixes have. Inflectional affixes, you might think of them as sort of a little bit more superficial in terms of their meaning. They exist primarily to mark grammatical properties of a word, so functional properties like person, like first person, I am talking, second person, you are talking, third person, he, she, it is talking. So that is what I mean by person. Number is either like singular or plural in English. There are actually some other languages out there which can have like dual number, where you talk about just two people at a time. Gender, male, female, neuter, so on and so forth. Tense, aspect. So different affixes can attach to nouns and verbs to just signal different values of these different grammatical properties. They don't change other aspects of meaning, so that's what I mean by them being kind of semantically superficial. They're also going to be required by the rules of sentence structure, so often they have to sort of relate to another word in the sentence to give you what's called agreement. And they create a new word form rather than a new word on its own. And you can contrast basically all these properties of inflectional affixes with the corresponding properties of derivational affixes. So a derivational affix will change the meaning of the word, and therefore it creates a new word with a different sort of sound form and a different meaning too. And then in a lot of cases, derivational affixes will have clear semantic content. So you can kind of look at the affix by itself and say, well, that means this. Like I gave you an example of unattaching to adjectives, and it means like the opposite of that adjective, like unhealthy or uncertain, so on and so forth. By the same token, a derivational affix might change the lexical category of the word as well, and in addition to changing the meaning of the word. Yeah, so inflections versus derivational affixes, and I will give you examples of the inflectional affixes in English. Luckily for us, there are only 8 inflectional affixes we have to worry about in English. There are other languages out there which have far more than 8. You may know one of those languages. We're not going to study them in detail in this particular class. We're going to keep it manageable by just walking through these 8. So you know how to identify them if you encounter them, say, in a morphology practice exercise or a homework exercise for this course or anything else you might do with morphology in life. Okay, so all kidding aside, I'll walk you through these. Normally I write these on the board, and they're specific to different kinds of lexical categories in English. So the first is an S suffix, and it only applies to third-person verbs. So we have a verb like wait, I wait, you wait, but he waits. So you add the S just because the subject of that is in the third person, no other reason, and that is what we call agreement. Another inflectional suffix, which adds itself to what we call the progressive form of a verb, is the ing suffix. So I wait, you wait, he is waiting. So if you have that is in front of the wait verb, you have to add ing to it. So there's agreement kind of at that level. Excuse me. And not every language in the world has this aspect of the verb. English is a bit unusual in that respect, but it means something that's kind of currently going on, which is why it's called progressive. There's the past tense affix ed, and this applies to most verbs in English. So you have wait, or like I wait, but you waited in the past at some time, and that's how we signify that with this suffix added to the root of the verb. And then there is also, for some verbs, the past participle suffix en. So I eat, you eat, she has eaten. So yeah, or the cake was eaten by the group at the party, what have you. This is kind of similar to the ed suffix in that it indicates something that happened in the past. In the first context I mentioned, I have eaten or she has eaten, so on and so forth. It forms what is called the past participle form of the verb, something that has been completed in the past rather than something that just generally happened in the past. And it's en rather than ed. Those are the verbs. Those are the inflectional affixes which can attach to verbs in English. Other than that, we have a couple which can attach to nouns. So we have the plural suffix s, which we've seen before. So you can have 1 card, but 2 cards, 3 cards, so on and so forth. Anything more than 1 card, you have to have cards. There's also a possessive marker, which looks or sounds at least identical to the plural suffix and also the third person verb suffix. So it's dad goes to dad. So there's my dad, but there's my dad's car, so on and so forth. We spell this one differently as long as we remember how to spell it correctly. This is kind of in flux in modern texted English, but it's called the possessive marker because it shows you that, the noun owns something or it has possession of something. And it's spelled with an apostrophe s officially in prescriptive grammar. There are also 2 suffixes, 2 inflectional affixes, which we can apply to adjectives. The first is the comparative suffix. So this is normally er, like somebody can be tall, but somebody else can be taller, or somebody can be short and somebody else can be shorter, so on and so forth. You just add that suffix to the root of the adjective. And there's also superlative, which is est. So somebody is weak, but that person is the weakest. Somebody is tall, that person is the tallest, so on and so forth. For the most part, these are pretty regular and consistent throughout the language, along with the past tense suffix, but there are a few exceptions which are kind of interesting, and we'll take a look at those in a bit. Yeah, all of these inflectional affixes in English happen to be suffixes. That is not always the case in inflectional morphology across the languages of the world, but again, in English, we're relatively lucky in that this part of our system is pretty simple, so hopefully you can kind of wrap your head around it. I would take a little bit of time before you're doing sort of the morphology practice exercises and the homework exercises to just kind of focus on this list for a while and get a sense of all 8 different affixes so you can identify them pretty easily. But remember that there are 4 here which are applying to verbs. There are 2 which are applying to nouns, and there are 2 which are applying to adjectives. So that should hopefully keep them manageable in your mind in terms of how much you need to remember. Okay, other languages, as I've alluded to, can have a lot more inflectional affixes, or many more inflectional affixes, you might say, depending on what sort of grammatical mood you're in. So I'll give you some examples from French. This is the French verb to speak is parler, which I can say a little bit easier than or more easily than the Italian verb for to speak, which I'm not going to try again. I'm conceding defeat on that one for now until I try to go to Italy again. But if I ever want to go to France or Quebec, what have you, I could say nous parlons, which means we speak. So you can see here again that there is sort of this root form of parle in French without this ER ending, which is pronounced A in French. And then if we want to say we speak, we have the on ending to it. The second person plural, so like you all or you guys speak, is parler. If we want to say this in the past tense, we say things like je parlais, or we spoke, nous parlions, so on and so forth. There's different endings that attach to this root form for French for all these different contexts. So one thing that doesn't happen in English is that we're not changing different or applying different inflectional affixes to sort of different persons in the past tense. We just have one that works across the board. So English is simpler in that respect than French. But anyways, if you can kind of imagine, I'm not going to list them all out here. There can be a large number of these different inflectional affixes if they're going to change both according to person and tense. So there's a lot of those affixes for French that you have to learn if you are either a native speaker of French or learning it as a second language. I know a lot of you have accomplished that, so you may know these already. So my wife is Ukrainian, so I have learned some Ukrainian, and I can attest to the fact that Ukrainian has a ton of inflectional affixes, which for linguists are kind of fun to learn. For most other people, I think they would be potentially quite discouraging. I've got another example of a language like that, which is called Volapük. And normally in class, I'm able to ask the question before I present this, which is, does anybody know what Volapük is or is about? And I'd say maybe one out of every other year, there is somebody who does know what Volapük is. And I'll show you the main point of what I want to say about the language, which is what a Volapük verb conjugation looks like. But as I walk you through this, I'll let you know that Volapük itself is the world's first constructed language, which means that it is not a natural language. It is just a language that some, I don't know, motivated guy made up in his basement just by kind of writing out words that meant different things for, everything in a new language which nobody had ever spoken before. So I think his goal in creating this language is mostly just for the fun of that sort of creative activity, but it's based to a certain extent on European languages which already existed at the time. I think he created this in the 1880s. The name of the language itself, Volapük, means world speak. So I think he had some ambitions of this becoming sort of a universal language that anybody could use or learn. The problem with it is that being a language nerd, because who else would create a language from scratch? But being a language nerd, he kind of enjoyed these features of language like inflectional affixes. So this is how you conjugate or can conjugate the verb to notify in Volapük. So lenotun, lenotob, lenotobs, lenotol, lenotos. I'm not going to go through all these. There's a lot of different forms. And in fact, if you want to learn the language, guess what? You have to learn every single one of these forms. So that's not super easy to do. And if you can believe it, Volapük was not actually that much of a hit in terms of language learning in the 1800s, even though this guy may have really enjoyed putting it together. There's just too much sort of arbitrariness that you have to learn at the end of the day. I will, however, say, as long as we're on this topic, I think I can't remember exactly where I read this article. I did read it. I didn't think that I read it. It was an article about some guy who had taken the time to learn Volapük just for fun, probably a language nerd himself. And he wrote about the experience in the New Yorker. and was talking about the time where he was at some, fancy social party in some apartment high above Manhattan or something like that. And he was telling a friend of his, I've learned the language Volapük, but I don't have anybody to speak it with. And then at the party, there was some woman who turned around and said, "You know Volapük? Are you kidding? I know it too." Yeah. And a romance blossomed from that particular moment in life, which is amazing. Unfortunately, it didn't work out in the long term. I remember that part of the article. But, this is where linguistics can get you in life. The possibility for dates, maybe. Anyways, that's Volapük in terms of its inflectional affixes. It has more than English. There are also derivational affixes, and I want to give you some examples of those. We've seen them before, actually. They're the ones we've been working with already. So these affixes like re, which can attach to like recycle or reattach or something like that. D for like decode, or say the Y in fishy changes fish to fishy, or the I's in vandalize, so on and so forth. These affixes are creating new words rather than just new word forms that have to sort of agree with some other word in the sentence for syntactic purposes. English, which has just a small set of inflectional affixes, has far more derivational affixes. So when you want to learn English, you have to learn all of those. You're a bit lucky with that, though, in terms of the fact that they have a clear meaning, but there's just sort of a larger arbitrary set of them. And to be fair, I will show you briefly some examples of derivations in Volapük. So as I mentioned before, pük means language or speech. So here's all the words you can kind of derivationally create out of that root. Like pükik means linguistic, pukatidel means language teacher, pukapuk means defect of speech, so on and so forth, pukat, oration, puka, philology, bipuk, preface, so on and so forth. There's a lot of these as well. So it would take a while to remember or learn how to remember all those too, but maybe not quite as much as there were for the inflectional affixes. But it's nice because you have this root which kind of consistently appears in a variety of different words, so it kind of gives you a sense of what that word might mean if you haven't seen it before. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Volapük, I promise. However, we will see other artificial languages as we go, so keep an eye out for them. Okay, this is the last time I'm going to talk about this phenomenon or this pattern that we see in affix morphology, but inflectional affixes are always going to attach to a root with a particular part of speech. So basic example of this is how we create plural nouns in English. You just take a singular noun and add s to it. So this again is an inflectional affix. It's only going to attach to nouns. We saw 3 different kinds basically of inflectional affixes: 2 that attach to nouns, 4 that attach to verbs like ed, and then 2 that attach to adjectives like er. So taller and shorter, weighted and talked for the verbs, so on and so forth. They have to attach to specific lexical categories. There's no other way they're going to work. There's no ambiguity in that really either, except for the fact that we happen to use the same sort of sound string, this s, the suffix s, for 3 different kinds of affixes, inflectional affixes, which I guess is just random chance more than anything else. That being said, I will ask you a question here. If you have both a derivational and an inflectional affix attaching to a root in some order, which one of these is going to attach first, the derivational or the inflectional affix? I'll let you think about that for a second. I'm making these at the same time each day, but there's less and less light as we move on through the summer. So maybe I should get going on these a bit earlier in the future so you can actually see my face. But my face doesn't matter. What does matter is the answer to this question. So let's say you have a complex word with both a derivational and inflectional affix in it. Which one attaches first? Hopefully you figured out the answer, that derivational affixes will attach before the inflectional affixes do. And one way you can kind of think about this is just you need to create the new word before you create the new word form. and you create a new word with the derivational affix, and then you create the inflectional affix on top of that. Or so you create the word form on top of that with the inflectional affix. So I'll give you some examples here where we see it working in both the correct way and the incorrect way. So we've seen this word blackened before. For that one, we start out with the adjective black, and then we can add the derivational affix "n" to it to get the verb blacken. And that's the present tense of the verb, but if we want to make it past tense, we can add the ed to it afterwards and we get blackened. Similarly, we have governments, which is the plural form of government. And again, we're going to form government first by adding ment to the verb govern, and then just add the s after that to the noun that gets created out of this first step in the process to get governments. You're never going to get this in the opposite direction or the opposite order. So you never get governsment, or you never get blackton, or whatever this would be, or neighborshood. You get neighborhoods instead, right? If you're doing this in the appropriate order, and grammar says you have to, the derivational affix will always be closer to the root than the inflectional affix, which will be more kind of on the outside of the word. And in English, it'll just be at the end because all of the inflectional affixes are suffixes. Okay, I'll just give you a little note here for clarifications and enrichment's sake. But there is a term called a lexeme, which refers to a group of related word forms. And I've got a variety of word forms here for the verb wait. So we kind of have the root here, wait, and then the third person form, waits, and then the past tense, waited, and also the progressive, waiting, so on and so forth. These are all different word forms of this particular verb created by attaching different inflectional affixes to that root. If I want to refer to sort of the canonical form of the lexeme is the whole group. The canonical form of the lexeme is called a lemma. And you can kind of think about this as like the head word in a dictionary. I actually don't know how often or how much students these days actually look in a paper printed dictionary, or if you just look at these things online all the time. But if you are sort of familiar with the process of thumbing through the dictionary to find out what something means, you normally will see entries that look like this. So this is for the verb repel, and this part of it is the head word or the lemma of the whole lexeme entry here. So this is kind of what you're looking up in general, but then this will tell you there are different kind of inflectional forms of this particular verb, like repelled or repelling. And these aren't particularly special because, you know, you can just add these inflectional affixes to the original to get the appropriate form for, say, the past tense or the progressive. And then it tells you what it means, so on and so forth. And at the end, it actually, in this particular case, for this particular dictionary, will tell you there are other words which are related to this one through the application of a pretty straightforward word formation rule using a derivational affix like "er." So there's Mitch Hedberg's favorite morpheme again, but you can repel something, and if you do, then you become a repeller. You know, I think we're familiar with that formation. You might say, if you have been repelled, then you're the repellee. If somebody has tried to, you know, disgust you away from them. So each one of these here is a word form. This is the lemma, and I guess this one is a word form as well, but it's a special one because it's the canonical form of the whole lexeme, and this is a different lexeme by itself, repeller. So we can add sort of different inflectional affixes to this one, like repellers, to get the plural form of this word, and that would be a new word form for a different lexeme. Okay, inflectional affixes relate a lexeme to its various forms. The derivational affixes relate one lexeme to another lexeme. So they kind of have a different status, therefore, in terms of our morphological rule sets. One is creating new words, and the other is just creating new word forms as part of our grammar of the language. Okay, another distinction which I can tune you into is that, and this one maybe is a little bit fuzzier than inflectional versus derivational, but it only applies to different types of derivational affixes. And I'll show you the basics of how it works. So there are what are called class 1 or maybe level 1 derivational affixes, which are sort of derivational affixes which cause more profound changes in the root when it creates a new word, both at the phonological or sound level and also the semantic or meaning level. So these may change the sounds that we pronounce when we actually say the root form of the word, and they may also sort of give you an entirely different meaning from the basic root form of the word. They can also combine with bound roots as well. I've got some examples here in terms of just the bare morphemes themselves, like ity, e, and ion, but I'll show you some specific examples too. So let's say we have the ity morpheme we're playing around with. Oops, I forgot to bold something here. But ity can attach to the word electric and give you electricity. And so the meaning connection here is fairly obvious, just as it is for stupid and stupidity. But one thing that happens with electric going to electricity, which hopefully you're aware of, is that when we have the word electric by itself, this ends in sort of that hard C sound, the k sound, electric. But when we add this affix to it, that k sound turns into an S or a soft C sound, so electricity. Which is interesting in part because we represent both those sounds with the same letter. That's where this weird spelling convention actually comes in handy for English, because this letter can represent two different sounds which are kind of related to one another morphologically rather than phonologically in terms of their sound values. Stupid to stupidity actually has a kind of similar sound change in the root. So stupid, the stress is on the first syllable. Stupid, you put more emphasis on that first syllable. And then for stupidity, that emphasis shifts over here to the second syllable of stupid, stupidity, because we're adding this affix to it. Where I forgot to put the bolding was going from Democrat to democracy. This one is a little more opaque in terms of how it functions because we have a T here, Democrat, going to like a S sound, which is spelled by a C. Yeah. Blame it on the Greeks who gave us this word and I guess system, although I kind of like the system. But it gets complicated in terms of the rule you have to use to express how this change gets made. Act goes to action. This is kind of similar as a T at the end of act, but it turns into more of a sh sound, action, when you add an ion to it. So these affixes or these suffixes can sort of change the sounds you actually pronounce when you say the root after they've attached to them. Yeah, I think all these are fairly easy to perceive in terms of their semantic connection between the sort of root form and the complex form. Class 2 suffixes or derivational affixes are less likely to create any phonological changes in the root, any sound changes in the root, and they have less of a semantic meaning on everything as well. So I'll give you some examples here: ness, less, again, and ish. Yeah, so I'll give you examples, and as I walk through them, I'll point out that normally class 1 affixes are going to attach to the root before class 2 affixes, so they're kind of more tightly bound to the root form, which is why they get preference in this classification scheme, over class 2 affixes. So class 1 affixes are closer to the root form than class 2. We see this in like divisiveness. So this is also an interesting example. So the root here is kind of divide, right? And then we add iv to it and we get divisive. And then we can add this class 2 affix to that afterwards to get divisiveness, which doesn't really change sort of anything going on here in divisive. When you add the iv, though, it changes that last sound in the root. Yeah, relational, it starts out with the relate. When we add the ion to it, that changes the T from a T to a sh sound. And then we add ul to it at the tail end. But in this particular case, the ul also happens to be a class 1 affix. You can get like fearlessness. This is two class 2 affixes attaching to the original word fear. And they can kind of go in whatever order is appropriate for kind of the lexical categories there. So fear is a noun, fearless is an adjective, and fearlessness is another noun. So you kind of have to add them in that order. What you can't get is a class 1 affix in the same spot as ness, even though it might have the same function overall in terms of how its word formation rule works. So you can have fear, you can have fearless, but you can't have fearlessity because this is a class 2 affix and this is a class 1 affix. So it's weird to kind of add that after you've added something more superficial to the root. Yeah, so there's kind of an order which applies here, as well as a sort of superficial versus profound distinction between the two types of affixes as well. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll mention that there is a concept that people talk about in morphology, which is called productivity. So that's the extent to which a word formation rule can be applied to new morphemes to form new words. So we've seen how you can be creative or productive in language by creating, say, new words in general, or maybe uttering new sentences or understanding new sentences which you've never heard before. You can kind of be creative with word formation rules as well. You can use the rule to apply to new forms which it's never applied to before. And if you can do that with a derivational affix and expect somebody else to still understand you, then you're saying that you're exhibiting morphological productivity, or that that particular affix is very productive in the language. So when this happens, class 2 affixes are usually more productive than class 1 affixes. And I think we'll see this fairly quickly with this example again of ness versus itty. So both ness and itty attach to adjectives, and they form nouns as the result of that process. Both of them have the same meaning. They mean the quality of the adjective that the suffix attaches to originally. So you can have, say, somebody who's blind, and then the quality of that is blindness. Or you can have somebody who's stupid, hopefully not, but when you add itty to it, that means the quality of being stupid. Happy can also go to happiness, or valid goes to validity. You notice in both of these there's a stress shift from the first to the second syllable when you add itty to it, or goodness and complexity, so on and so forth. Yeah. Ness is a very productive affix in English, so it can expand its reach to the words which we normally apply a class 1 derivational suffix to. So you can say, instead of stupidity, you could say stupidness, and somebody might think you're stupid for saying that, but you're not really. You're just being productive, right? You're being a little bit creative, and I think everybody would still understand what you're saying. So stupidness or validness or complexness, those all basically work. If we try to go the other way with itty, it just doesn't work nearly as well. So we have blindness, but you can't really say blindity. That's just weird. Then people might think you're stupid, hopefully not. You can't say happity or goodity. Those are just bad. So we'll star those out of existence because they never should have been created in the first place. Ness is also so productive that it can be affixed to new words in general. So there's kind of a funny word, truthiness, which was invented out of thin air, sort of like Volapük, about 15 years ago by the comedian Stephen Colbert on his late night talk show. This is during the George Bush administration. I don't know, I guess Stephen Colbert is still saying things about the truth in Donald Trump's administration, but back then it seemed like a pretty clever thing to say, that there was this quality called truthiness where, you can say something which is not strictly speaking true, but it feels like it should be true, so therefore it's truthy, and that quality is truthiness. This is also about the time that Wikipedia was becoming popular, so people thought you could say whatever you wanted to on Wikipedia and people would believe it, which is kind of true. I guess it's truthy. Chairness. I'll never forget this weird day in English class when my English professor was getting all philosophical and picked up a chair and said, "This is a chair, but have you ever seen chairness?" I was like, "Not really, but I know what it is." So chairness, like the quality of being a chair, I guess. Some things are more cherry than others. Okay. I hope I don't get into trouble with all this creativity. Productive. Normally, when you want to talk about the quality of being productive, you talk about productivity, right? Like the title of this slide. And then if you want to, though, you could say productiveness, and I think everybody would still understand what you're saying. even though maybe the prescriptive world would expect you to say productivity. Here's an example from the Mr. Burns quick write of this sort of productivity or productiveness. This student, this is from a while back, said that to a certain extent, I do think it is realistic to portray Mr. Burns as having a dictionary in his head because the image of a dictionary is a symbolic representation of the finiteness of our memories to contain certain things like words. And this is nice because this particular student actually put a little hyphen here in between the root of the word she created here and the derivational affix that she applied to it. So ness is kind of escaping from the bounds of being a bound morpheme when she creates this particular word. If you want to get all formal about it, there is an official alternative to finiteness, which is finitude. And you can see that there's sort of changes in the root here. Finite is something that is like limited, has an end. And finitude, the root is finite here, which is not said or pronounced the same way as finite. So there's some change there going on, as we'd expect with a level 1 or class 1 affix. There's also a different suffix that was sort of briefly productive as sort of a language game for a while amongst people who may or may not have thought they were being cool by using it. So this was sort of a vestige of my younger years in the 90s where people would go around and say or add edge to things like, oh, did you get some sleepage? Oh, look at all the wordage in that document, so on and so forth. I don't know if people still play that game. Maybe it just sounds hopefully dated or hopelessly dated, hopefully, to you. But, you know, sometimes productivity can kind of emerge just for fun, do its thing for a while, and then keep moving on. But this used to be a productive affix, edge. There are other productive morphemes in English. Able is a very good one. I once had a friend make up this word, make fun of able. Just, again, describing a property that some particular, verb has. So I think you can say something is marketable or sellable, so on and so forth. This is a kind of, more complex verb because it has 3 words in it. Make fun of is a verb, and then you can turn it into an adjective and say it's make funofable. Perhaps like this lecture, hopefully not. Other morphemes are not as productive, however. So there's a suffix th in English, which applies to just a handful of roots. So we have the adjective warm, and we can create warmth out of that. We have the adjective wide, and we can create width out of that. Deep goes to depth. But you can't apply this to, say, some other temperature like cool. So we don't say coolth. We could say coolness or maybe the cold. But th is not productive in this context. We have n. We've talked about that before with blacken. So we have redden, maybe moisten from moist. At another friend used the word cuten. I don't know if you're okay with cuten. Like I'm going to cuten up this lecture by bringing Winnie the Pooh back. Is it cuter now? Maybe. Are you okay with that word? Maybe. Could you even see Winnie the Pooh? I should probably turn on the lights. I don't think this works with abstract, like abstracten. That's a little too abstract of a root for this to work with, so I'm going to X that one out. This one's a maybe. But either way, this morpheme, it's really a stretch to try to keep applying it to new forms. Affy is another one. It attaches to adjectives to form verbs, so like justify from just or purify from pure. That's okay. Can you use it with quick though? Like quickify, make something more quick? Maybe. Smartify, I'm going to make that person smarter or smartify them. All right. Bizify is one I've actually heard, which also seems like a stretch, but it's kind of possible. Uglify, that one's I think a legitimate word in the dictionary. I'm not going to look it up at the moment. So this one kind of has some productivity, maybe not as much as ness or able, but more than th for sure. Productivity can sometimes be limited by the existence of other words. So ness, as I mentioned before, is a very productive affix, and it attaches to adjectives to create nouns, meaning the quality of that adjective. So an adjective like intelligent could, in theory, go to intelligentness. And if somebody said that, I think you would know what they are saying, but it's a lot more likely that somebody would say intelligence because it's already a perfectly fine option, which kind of gets in the way. It's more opaque in terms of how it's constructed. We don't use this kind of CE suffix a whole lot or change root forms in this way often, but it's a common word, so I think people would be likely to know what it means. Intelligence will therefore block intelligentness from existence, and we don't really use this word ever. So a similar example, we talked about truthiness. What we would probably never talk about, though, is trueness, or maybe it might mean something different if we did, because we already have a word truth, which is the quality of being true. And this is where we're getting that th suffix back into play here, like in warmth or depth. There's a word inhabitant, which is somebody who inhabits a place. And I believe this is derived from French. You could, in theory, say that somebody is an inhabitor of a location. I don't know if you ever would, because you can kind of just say inhabitant, and that would work better. So even though this is a productive affix, we don't use it in this context. Guide could, in theory, go to guider. So guide is a verb. It also happens to be a noun, so you can kind of just switch lexical categories there, and you can talk about how the guide guides us. You don't say the guider guides us. You could, though. Maybe you can run that experiment and let me know how it goes. I'd be interested to hear the results. And then there are some cases where it seems like a form should be blocked because there is a pre-existing form, but then it isn't. So we have a noun, a noun pride. And in theory, you could create an adjective out of that by saying prideful. And guess what? Some people do, even though there's already an adjective that exists called proud. So now we have two words, prideful and proud, which kind of mean the same thing. And when I talk about this in class, I often get comments that for the people who use both of these words, they do have different meanings for them. And I think, if I remember correctly, the people who make that distinction say that this one has a more negative connotation, like being prideful is having too much pride in yourself, maybe in a religious context, and being proud is like, oh, I'm proud, my baby boy took his first steps today or something like that. So this one has more of a positive connotation. In that case, maybe blocking would fail in case you wanted to create a new meaning which wasn't encompassed by the original word in the first place. But when you already have the original word serving the same purpose, like an intelligence, you wouldn't need to create intelligentness unless somehow this would wind up meaning something different. That being said, when blocking fails, languages change. So if the old guard is saying things like truth or inhabitant, and a group of young people will just start saying trueness or inhabitor, there's not a whole lot that the old people can do to stop them, and eventually the old ways will disappear and new words will come take their place. Last distinction I want to talk about, that there are both what are called content and function words in language. So content words are words that have semantic content or meaning is kind of the easiest way to think about it. So things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs have some clear meaning to them, like words like politics, baseball, love, hate, green, create, so on and so forth. You can contrast those with what are called function words, which kind of just exist in a sentence or in the spoken language to specify grammatical relationships between different content words. So these don't have any sort of obvious semantic content to themselves, or if they do, you kind of have to think about it a little bit in terms of trying to figure out how to define them. So these are words like prepositions, pronouns, or conjunctions. And I'll give you some examples here in a second, but I can look at a few here. Like the word or is a conjunction, so that would work as a function word rather than a content word. Grammatical is a content word, so on and so forth. Some is a function word, so on and so forth. Content words are often described as an open class, which means that you can easily add new members to it anytime you want. You can just create a new content word if you want to, like blog or Skype or something like that, which are words which have emerged in my adulthood that did not used to exist, and you can kind of know what they mean. Function words, on the other hand, are generally closed, so it's not super easy or even maybe possible to add new members to that set of words. And this is actually kind of where the previous quick write was coming from, which is about the use of new sort of gender-free pronouns in English. So again, when I first started teaching this class a while back, the idea of sort of creating a new set of pronouns in English was just thought to be basically impossible for linguistic reasons, and possibly also because of societal reasons. But as we know, a lot of people go now by pronouns which are not he or she, or he, him, she, her, what have you. But it's interesting the way that that worked out. So I gave you some examples in the quick write because people have been talking about these possibilities for a long time. And a lot of people have tried to create other variants like e or co, or there's one thon, which I kind of enjoy, but those didn't stick as well. And usually when people want to use sort of gender-free pronoun for themselves, they go with they and them, which are not really an entire new pronoun. It's just sort of a new use for that pronoun in English. And you can tell me if you've ever heard a new preposition. New proposition. If you've ever heard a new preposition in English, because I'm willing to bet you never have. And you can try to create a new preposition if you want to. I don't even know how that would work. But again, if you run that experiment, let me know how it turns out. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the quick write, and I'll try to sort of highlight some of the more interesting thoughts I get from that to share with you all. Otherwise, I just want to say that your minds, or our minds, process function words differently from content words. And I've got some better examples here of function versus content words in this particular utterance or sentence. So are, also, from, those are all function words. Function, process, content words, those are all content words. And it may not be immediately obvious to you that there is a difference, but I'm going to give you an example on the next slide. And normally I do this in class to show people how we process function words differently from content words, because these function words just don't have meaning and are kind of a limited set to begin with. So our minds kind of, well, you'll see what they do. But what I want you to do when I show you the next slide is to tell me how many F's are in the following passage. And normally I do this in class and I bring a donut with me so that the person who gets the answer correct first gets a free donut. So when I make that offer, it has certain consequences, but I'm going to make it again now. And the first correct answer I receive to this question, whether it's in the comments or like by email, what have you, you will get a donut, or maybe at least a coupon for a donut or something like that. But I want you to sort of do this task as quickly as you can. So for how many F's are in the following passage? Here we go. Ready? All right. You may have already figured out the answer, or thought you figured out the answer. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'm just going to tell you that this is the end of the lecture. And you can stare at this long enough as it takes, or as long as it takes, to figure out how many F's are in this passage. And I'm done for today. We're going to have one more lecture on morphology about different types of word formation processes. We'll do that next. So I'll see you for that. And otherwise, I hope that after this lecture is done, that you are one donut richer.